This week, our mini-series takes us to Georgia, where the Stocking Strangler caused terror among residents in Georgia. Although police would eventually find this person, there is some speculation if they put to death the right person. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. During an 8-month period in Columbus, Georgia, from 1977 to 1978, a serial killer known as the Stocking Strangler would become known. Although there was a massive police presence, it seemed that the killer continued to elude capture. Soon, police would realize that the serial killer had a specific pattern. Typically, his victims were defenseless, elderly white women who lived alone. He would beat them, rape them, and then strangle them with a stocking. It seemed afterwards the bodies were then arranged in a particular manner. And they did notice that there was no valuables taken from the homes, which meant that the prime motivation was the attack on the women. In February of 1970, Marion Brewer, who was 62, was found strangled in her hotel room in Albany. She would be found face up in bed. There was visible marks on her throat, and unfortunately, she had been raped. Although her purse was near her body, there was no money inside. 2 months later, in April of 1970, Neely Farmer, who was 85, was found dead in her hotel room, also in Albany. Her body was partially clothed and found on the floor next to the bed. There was a long piece of fabric around her neck, and it appeared that she was raped. Her cause of death was manual strangulation. A third attempted assault on an elderly woman would lead to an arrest, and the fingerprints left behind matched those of the Farmer murder. This would soon lead police to a man known as Carlton Gary. Carlton Gary was born in Columbus, Georgia in September of 1950. It appears that his father was a construction worker who had nothing to do with him, and his mother was a poor woman who was just struggling to survive. Because Gary's mother was poor, the family spent a lot of time relocating. It was noted that he was often hungry and malnourished as a child. Because of his mother's situation, he would spend a lot of time with his aunt or his great aunt, and they were both maids to elderly, wealthy women. Unfortunately, while in elementary school, Carlton Gary would suffer a head trauma, where he was knocked unconscious on the playground. It appears in his teens he became a heavy drug user, and between the ages of 14 to 18, he was arrested numerous times for assault and robbery. Around the 1970s, he would marry a woman and have 2 children with her, and they would eventually relocate to Albany, New York. Around this time, Carlton Gary apparently wanted to become a singer, and that's why they moved there, but it seems like he just couldn't stay out of trouble. When police matched these fingerprints to Carlton Gary, of course they hauled him in for questioning. Carlton would admit to having taken part in the robbery, but he claimed that his accomplice, a man named John Lee Mitchell, was responsible for the murder. He would end up testifying against his friend in court, and John Lee Mitchell was charged, but there was no evidence connecting him to that crime. Carlton Gary was then charged with robbery, and he would serve time in prison in New York for this. After he was paroled in 1975, he moved to Syracuse, New York. Unfortunately, he would continue his pattern of attacks. While in Syracuse, he would attack, rape, and strangle 2 more elderly women in their homes. One died, but the other, luckily, had survived. The attacks occurred only within 4 days of each other. And unfortunately, the survivors were unable to identify Gary positively because it was dark when the crimes occurred. But they did know a black male had attacked her. At the time, Gary was never charged with these crimes, but he was sent back to prison on a parole violation after he was caught trying to sell coins stolen from the same apartment building of the victims. And then in August of 1977, Gary would escape prison by sawing through the bars of the cell, and he would head back to Columbus, Georgia. Unfortunately, a month later, after he escaped, he raped, beat, and strangled 60-year-old Ferna Jackson to death with a nylon stocking at her home in Georgia. 9 days later, a 71-year-old woman known as Jean Dimenstein was murdered. She was raped, beaten, and strangled. And then an 89-year-old woman known as Florence Schiebel was murdered in October. Florence was an 89-year-old woman who was nearly blind and could only get around with her walker. She was often seen outside cleaning up her yard of her small apartment. Detectives speculate that Carlton Gary slipped in. He would then rape her, beat her, break her neck in the process, and then strangle her with a stocking. And then on October 25th, 4 days later, Martha Thurmond, who was 69, was murdered. And then on December 28th, 74-year-old Kathleen Woodruff was murdered in the same fashion, except no stocking had been left at the scene. 2 months later, in February of 1978, Ruth Schwab, who was in bed, was attacked, but she was able to trigger an alarm by her bedside as she's being attacked, and the intruder, Gary Carlton, would flee. But he only made it 2 blocks down the road before breaking into another house and raping and strangling 78-year-old Mildred Borum. On April 20th of 1978, his final victim was 61-year-old Janet Kofer. And then things would take an incredibly strange turn. After police announced that they had a suspect who was an African-American man, a man calling himself the chairman of the Forces of Evil threatened to murder Black women if the Stocking Strangler was not stopped. So as these attacks are happening on these elderly white women, they also find the bodies of 2 young Black sex workers outside of Fort Benning, which was nearby where these murders were happening. When the police received this note, the note said that it was a gang of 7 white men who was holding a Black woman hostage and would kill her if the Stocking Strangler wasn't apprehended. Eventually, they would continue to send letters and they demanded a ransom of $10,000. And then the phone calls would start. Investigators would realize the alleged hostage that this gang of evil men had, Gail Jackson, had been murdered 5 weeks before she was found and before the first letter was sent. She was only 21 years old and her body was found in April of 1978. The FBI would get involved and they created a profile which stated the killer was one man, not 7, that he was Black, not white, he was single, not well educated, and probably a low-ranking military man at the fort in his late 20s. Because of this profile, they would identify a man known as William Hance, and he was arrested for murder. He would confess to killing both women and to killing a third woman at Fort Benning in September of 1977. And it appears that he did this in an effort to kind of cover up his own murders. Police would realize that William Henry Hance was not the Stocking Strangler. In December of 1978, a robbery that happened in South Carolina would lead detectives to Carlton Gary yet again. He was arrested and confessed, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for armed robbery. But in typical Carlton Gary fashion, he escaped custody in 1983. He would remain at large for another year before he was apprehended. At this point, new evidence had come to light, including a gun that was traced back to Gary and a possible fingerprint match that led police to believe that Gary was the serial killer. Although police believed that they caught their serial killer, there was quite a bit of controversy around this catch. 2 surviving victims of the Stocking Strangler identified Carlton Gary as the person that attacked them. The thing is, the 2 survivors would testify against Carlton at trial, and they said that he strangled them into unconsciousness before attempting to rape them. And one survivor would positively identify him as her attacker in court. But the thing is, she had previously positively identified 3 other Black men as the attacker. And in her initial statement, she had indicated that it was too dark to distinguish the race of her attacker. But it does appear that his fingerprints were found at 4 of the crime scenes. Carlton Gary was indicted in May of 1984 and convicted for 3 of the murders. He would be sentenced to death. More evidence came to light when a reporter would write a book about the case. Journalist David Rose said that Gary's lawyers had refused state funding to carry out defense. They claimed there was evidence that Gary's fingerprints were not held to match the crime scene prints until 7 years later when the case was re-examined, in spite of the fact that Gary had been printed just 1 year after the murder. They would claim that Gary's interview, which he supposedly confessed, was not recorded, nor were there any notes taken. They would say that Gary's confession was written by a police officer in the days following the interview from his own recollection. They would say the confession was unsigned and undated, and Gary denied having made it. They would also claim that Carlton Gary's semen secretion did not match that of the perpetrators. They would also say that a bite wound on a victim allegedly hadn't matched Gary's bite mark pattern, but they did note that Carlton Gary had dental work in prison after the victim's deaths. They would further claim that the prosecution withheld evidence at trial. But in 2007, Gary was positively linked through DNA to the rape and murder of 40-year-old Marion Fisher, and this happened in New York in 1975. The U.S. Supreme Court would refuse to hear Gary's last appeal, and on December 4th, a court set a December 16th execution date for Gary. On December 15th, they would deny a request to stay his execution. And then on December 16th, only a few hours before the execution, the Georgia Supreme Court halted the execution to hold a hearing and determine whether DNA tests should be conducted to determine Gary's guilt or innocence. And then in February of 2018, a new execution date was set for March 15th, 2018. And then on March 15th, 2018, at 10:33 p.m., Carlton Gary was put to death. Carlton Gary's lawyers would go on to say, "A person who never got a fair trial and whose guilt has been seriously questioned by hard physical and scientific evidence suppressed by the state and not revealed until long after the trial will be executed. That execution would be a stain on the state of Georgia, the judiciary, and the parole board." The state would say, "Convictions and sentences have been exhaustively reviewed for the past 30 years in both state and federal court and found to be constitutionally sound." It seems the key evidence that Gary's lawyers were talking about was semen found on Thurman's body and Schiebel's sheets. They said that bodily fluid testing done on those samples likely excludes Gary as the attacker, and DNA testing could have confirmed that. But they did mention the testing couldn't be done because the samples were contaminated at a state crime lab. They did say that DNA evidence has surfaced that positively matches Gary to one of the attacks for which he wasn't charged. He had also been linked to nearly identical attacks in Georgia and New York, and he admitted to being at the crime scenes in both states, but he blamed the rapes and killings on other people, claims that they were obviously never able to confirm. It does appear that many believe that Carlton Gary was innocent based on some shoddy police work. I'm not sure I believe he's innocent, considering that there was similar crimes committed and obviously his DNA matched to those. I think as a serial killer, he very much had a pattern and he followed that. He could have potentially been convicted wrongly for certain crimes. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the case. Was Carlton Gary the Stocking Strangler, or did they botch the investigation and kill the wrong man? But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel and you'd like to support, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.